Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 30, Mental Health Services Protection Act. Adjourned debate. Mr. Clark.
Are there any members wishing to speak to the bill? The honourable member for Lacombe-Panoka.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's a privilege to rise and speak today to this bill. I think it's an important bill, and of course we're just getting into it, so there's lots of questions yet. I'm optimistic, though, that there are some good things here. I have a series of questions, though, that I think will be helpful. Let me begin by saying that good counselling is extremely important. I really do believe that many people in life do profit from the opportunity to sometimes just share their concerns and have somebody to think their way through their problem with, sometimes to receive encouragement and help, sometimes to get some actually concrete guidance that's useful for them to appropriate. So I think it's important that we consider this. Of course, there are two pieces to this Bill 30. One with regards to counsellors, the other with regards to the licensing of addiction centres, which is a different consideration altogether in many ways. I've had the privilege of being quite involved in a number of addictions treatment centres and counselling situations throughout the years. So let me begin, first of all, by talking about the College of Counselling Therapy. One of the values here of this will be that the insurance companies will have a clear understanding of who is an accredited or a reliable counsellor, so that in many cases there are health policies and mental health policies that they would pay toward, but in some cases now they're unsure about that. They're not. They do. It's a questionable issue for them. So I think it will be helpful in that way. I spoke actually to a counselling centre this afternoon in Red Deer, and they're actually in support of this bill basically for that very reason, because they feel it will help make clear for both them and the insurance companies when payment is to be authorized and when it's not. And they also feel that creating a college of counsellors may in fact help to relieve the shortage of qualified and capable counsellors in Alberta. We are facing tremendous addiction issues and the challenge of fentanyl and other things, and there is a need for counsellors. In many cases, people are having to wait for months and months to actually be able to see a qualified therapist. So by creating a college, this will, I think, help clarify some of this, help make it just a better relationship for all around. Because quite frankly, it is quite a wide open field at this point in time. So I think that it will be helpful in that regard. Smaller associations, though, have expressed some concerns about representation rights, so I hope that that will be addressed. Whether the representation will be fair and equitable all the way along, yeah, there's about 14 different associations across the province, and so pulling them together and making an equal playing field for all there, I think will be a useful exercise. With regards to the addiction treatment centres and licensing for them, I do have some questions on this, and I suspect that well, this bill is going through again in a rushed format. A couple of days. We just got it Thursday. We expect to have this passed in a few days here. How much consultation has actually taken place with some of those that are really doing addictions treatment? I suspect not a lot. I know a couple that I have phoned that no one ever spoke to them about it. So once again, we have a government that's rushing through with ideas, don't know where they get them from, because in many cases they're not speaking to the people who are actually doing the job. the people who are actually creating the assistance to people. There's a question that has been raised by one of them about the possibility of the regulation of fees, particularly for private centres. Will fees be regulated? How will they be set? On what basis will they be set? This is an important question for them. They would like to know, with regards to fees, how that's going to be managed or how it's going to be regulated, and how that will compare with the cost to government-run facilities. There's also clearly expected to be an increased cost to participants in some cases, and for many people for whom finding treatment is an extremely expensive proposition. Residential treatment is not cheap anywhere. Is this going to push the costs up again in a way that will exclude some people and actually create fewer people being able to take advantage of addiction treatments? There's questions about how this will influence ADAC. ADAC was originally created as a forum or as a context where Albertans could help Albertans. And there's always been a huge value of humans helping humans. And I get a little bit concerned if we take the idea that all help has to be somehow elitist or somehow professional, as if ordinary people can't help ordinary people. In many cases, it's friends, it's neighbors, it's family that stick with people that have addictions challenges, that walk with them through the journey, that pick up the pieces with them over and over and over again. And I think it's important that we somehow, in the midst of this, preserve the idea that all Albertans actually have something to contribute to this conversation, because it impacts their families, it impacts their lives, it impacts their jobs. And so I think that we really do need to make sure that this does not make it somehow exclusive in the sense that Albertans can't help Albertans, can't participate in that. It's been an ongoing challenge for new treatment centres to open. Sometimes it takes real spontaneity and creativity. I can cite two, for example, that are somewhat unique to the average run-of-the-mill. In my riding, there's one out in the country. It's out in a very rural area. It was started by actually a worker from Fort McMurray who used to work up there or do some contracting up there, and his daughter was killed by an alcoholic in a driving incident. Rather than just get mad and be mad at the world forever, this individual chose to try to do something about it. And he began to start to work just with people that he knew. He slowly built up a counseling center. He has professional staff on site. He has detox on site with 24-hour medical people available. He's expanded. He now has another one in Kelowna, one on the East Coast, one in California, and still growing. But the kind of innovation and creativity and spontaneity that he was able to exhibit to create a center that now has touched over the years hundreds of people's lives. I'm concerned when government regulation gets in the way and prevents those kinds of very good things from happening in Alberta. So I hope this doesn't become an issue where those kinds of new initiatives are restrained, are prevented through excessive regulation, where these kinds of good works for Albertans are no longer able to happen. Another one of the questions that has been asked by, and I was also going to say, the other centre, of course, is in Calgary. A lady there whose daughter also was having addictions issues, and she has been able to create some addictions treatment, and by really using the challenge and the effort and the discipline and the training of running. And by taking patients and working with them and challenging them to get to the point where they can run marathons, It helps them to get their lives under control, to develop some of the discipline and the inner strength to overcome their own counseling. Again, something that probably wouldn't start in the traditional professional sense, a very creative, innovative, unique, spontaneous kind of approach, and yet it's proven itself to become a very effective way of helping certain individuals find a way to manage and to deal with their addictions issues. So in each of these cases, unique and creative stories of how Albertans are helping Albertans, and I think that's an important piece that we need to not lose in the rush to regulate everything. Other questions that have been raised, who will be doing the inspections? Who will be going around and certifying and approving? The point was made by a couple of different people that hopefully it's somebody with both credentials but also real experience, someone who's actually worked in the field. To just send someone around with theoretical knowledge, with academic training and straight out of school, but no real experience, isn't likely to be very effective. And so it's one of the concerns that was raised. And quite frankly, to be blunt, the statement was made that we really hope it doesn't become a nitpicky, rule-driven situation versus one with common sense. Sometimes we get too much government regulation and rules become more important than actually helping people and actually creating human, innovative, creative, engaging ways of helping people. So it will be good to have some guidelines, but there are certainly some questions, there are certainly some concerns. I think also there are challenges going forward with how things will be defined, what will be the impact of those kinds of definitions. So, for instance, who will be providing the training for residential addiction, and again, how do new ones ever get started? Because we certainly clearly need more than we have in our province right now. So where does this professional development come from? And I mean, there have been many studies done that in many cases professional counseling doesn't even work. People statistically have as much success on their own as they do with so-called high-level professional training. So is this going to become a very siloed, single-focused model of treatment based only and entirely on a medical model, when in fact the problems that in many cases bring people to addictions in the first place are not medical. They're personal, they're social, they're economic, they're spiritual, and sometimes if you don't address these underlying issues, the addiction isn't actually dealt with in a way that's helpful. And then how much will all this cost? What is the licensing cost to the facilities? What is the licensing going to involve for the government to manage all of this? I think these are important questions. We have no idea what this is supposed to cost. And will standardization of practices, I've kind of already said this, but will standardization of practices create a single model or a very narrow focus of what counseling or particularly addiction treatment centers can actually look like? Because again, as I've just outlined, two unique different models, one out in the country where being out in the country, out of the rush of the city has proven to be a very helpful environment for a lot of clients. Will this exclude the opportunity for private facilities to even operate or to begin? Much the same as I would argue for choice in education. I think those with addictions ought to have the opportunity of choice in treatment. Not every facility, not every model works for everyone. One size does not fit all. And unless we allow an openness and a freedom to create many useful forms of service, we need a diversity of service in this as well. And if we really believe in diversity, then the policies and the regulations need to reflect that. They need to be supportive of that. So a couple of those questions. Yeah, I think those are my main points, my main concerns. I think that I will leave it at that, and hopefully we'll get some answers as we move forward to some of these kinds of things. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any other members wishing to speak? The Honourable Member for Calgary. Oh, 29-2A first. My apologies. Anybody under 29-2A? Seeing none. I will now recognize the Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Pleased to rise and speak today to Bill 30, Mental Health Services Protection Act. And at the outset, congratulate the Minister and the government to take on what is obviously a thorny issue after so many years of neglect. Somehow in this province we have allowed practitioners to put up a sign that says they can do such and such in the mental health area, but they can't do it in the physical health area or in any other profession, law, engineering. It's long overdue that we put some kind of standard in place, training requirements, consistent evaluation, ongoing education, evidence that they're moving with the times and learning new approaches to mental health and addictions issue, the most complex issues that our society deals with. And eminently reasonable that we use the best available evidence and ensure that we not only license people that are capable of providing the services they say they are, but evaluating them in an ongoing way so that we don't allow slippage, we don't allow incompetence, we don't allow some of the failures that we have experienced in our own personal lives through a failure to either see the right professional or be referred to the right professional or have those professionals accountable for results. And I guess I would have to say that the whole system suffers from a lack of evaluation, whether it's medical doctors or others. We need a rigorous system of evaluation that points to issues that are not satisfactory, either in terms of personal competence or in the practice of referral when people recognize it's beyond them and refer to someone else who they feel has the competence to deal with that particular issue, or if it's an institution that is providing suboptimal environments for healing and health to develop. So I was very much involved with the organizations with the acronym FACT, the Federation of Association of Counseling Therapists, and their 13 associations who have been pressing this for several years and supported them, and was very pleased to see the Minister take the time, create the energy around this, and provide some leadership that would ensure that that people do get appropriate referrals, appropriate treatment, at least to the best of our knowledge. And that includes, as I say, continuing education for these folks, because we have to be evaluating, researching, and learning all the time to provide the best, especially in a society that's changing as quickly as ours, and the stresses upon us clearly are changing with the times, given, for example, the virtual reality that we now live in and the tremendous impact of social media and the new addictions that we're identifying in relation to social relationships and issues, including the different drug problems. So I was pleased to see this come forward. I have a few concerns about some of the sections, and I'll raise those in passing, but for the record, this bill does create a new College of Counseling Therapy to oversee and regulate the profession, train, license, oversee training, licensing, continuing education, and sanctioning when there is a failure to meet standards. It requires residential addiction treatment facilities to be licensed, which will empower the province to enforce minimum standards and to address complaints. That's part of the concern I have, is that the province can enforce minimum standards, what's the role of the college in enforcing minimum standards? I think one of the questions has to be, what is the role of the province versus the role of the college in terms of individual centres and individual practitioners? The residential treatment facilities will be able to apply for a license for up to 4 years, starting July 2019, and will need to have in place something by November 1st. This is all good. Licensing and inspection and evaluation is all, I think, going to improve the protection of the public. In response to complaints, Section 9 of the bill permits facility licenses to be amended, suspended, or revoked. And inspectors can enforce standards by issuing stop orders and administrative penalties of up to $10,000 a day. All those, I think, are consistent with our standards for seniors' care, for example, and they need to be present for all public services as far as I'm concerned. Section 24 troubles me a bit in that it authorizes the minister to give directions to a service provider or any other person for the purposes of the Act where the minister considers it to be in the public interest or appropriate for the purpose of providing for matters related to health or safety. Again, this muddies the waters, I think, unless it's more clear than I recognize, in relation to practitioners' quality versus the institutional setting, and how far the government will step in where there's an ambiguity around whether it's the working conditions or the environment versus the quality of care provided by the individual practitioners, where the college should rightly have the primary role. Section 29.2 protects the psychotherapist. 29.3, the designation psychotherapist, for the exclusive use of the College of Counselling Therapy, the College of Alberta Psychologists, and the College of Physicians and Surgeons. Section 29.3 creates a new College of Counselling Therapy to regulate the profession and set standards for education and licensing, and the titles of, quotes, counselling therapist, addiction counsellor, drug and alcohol counsellor, child and youth care counsellor. These are specific expertise areas that really do need to be clarified, and training is somewhat unique, and it should be. The research has pushed us to new levels of understanding of family dynamics, child development, that need to distinguish between adult and child therapy, whether it's in addictions areas or other mental health issues. So I am pleased to see that. Currently, the residential addictions treatment facilities are not subject to inspections and are not required to follow minimum standards. This has to change, and I'm pleased to see that. With the passage of Bill 30, Alberta will become one of 3 Canadian provinces to regulate residential addiction treatment centres, and the 5th to regulate mental health counsellors. So we're making progress, as far as I'm concerned. Now, the devil's in the details. What standards are we going to require? What level of evidence will we base some of our evaluations on? One has to believe in the process of evaluation that we will provide the best of evidence from around the world, that we will set standards that are world-class, that we will have evaluators and accreditation experts that have looked at the literature, that have got a balance between the rigid medical model, which I heard the previous member mention, I would say the rather narrow focus of the medical model, and the need to expand that model much more broadly around mental health and addiction services, to the social, to the spiritual, to the environmental and social other dimensions of well-being. With the passage of Bill 30, 65% of clinical facilities in the province which are privately operated, and 5,000 unregulated practitioners currently, will be brought under some kind of an umbrella of oversight, which to me speaks to why we have a post-secondary institution. We set standards, we train by standards, and we evaluate by standards It's imperfect, but it's the best we have, and we have to bring that to bear on the mental health and addiction system. I'm interested to note that Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous will be exempt from these, and I'm not quite sure why, but I suppose it's partly because they don't enjoy the same public funding. But I'd be interested to know more about that. So I guess apart from the lack of clarity around where the government has a role to intervene and where the college has a role to intervene in quality of care services is not yet a clear area to me, and maybe it needs to be fleshed out in the regulations as it is with other colleges, where it is more clear what the institutional responsibility is and what the professional responsibility is for quality of care and ethical practice guidelines. But I see very little in this to cause consternation except for the timelines. And let me say, as my colleague from Lloydminster Vermilion has pointed out, this could impose a significant increased cost, no doubt. It's worth it, as far as I'm concerned, to provide some security and accountability for those systems. But how will we deal with grandfathering those who are competent, who are effective, who are successful in their programs, and to pull them out of their setting and force them to do a degree program or to do something to provide a whole new standard of degree is inappropriate. So there needs to be some grandfathering over a period of 5 to 10 years for those who have been in practice for years and who have demonstrated a level of clinical competence, not necessarily academic competence. And I'm sure the Minister is considering how to deal with that transitioning and the timing that's required for that, as well as the respect for those who have learned on the job. And here I'm thinking also of what are called peer counselors. Peer counselors and people with lived experience, former addicts, former people with bipolar disorder, those who have been effectively cared for and managed to heal it to whatever extent they can and to be treated successfully. They are tremendous potential candidates for therapy, for being in group therapy, for being one-on-one counselors. They have a tremendous life experience that must not be dismissed and must not be sidelined simply because we establish a college that needs to indeed set some standards for training and some standards for evaluation. So this transition is going to be critically important. It could be very harmful to some communities. It could be very harmful to getting the results we want if the cost becomes prohibitive for individuals to pull out of what they're doing to in a short period of time, establish a new credential. That cannot happen. We have too much stress on the system at the present time. We need these people to stay, in many cases, exactly where they are, do what they do, but to offer them the opportunity to upgrade, to learn new skills, to new approaches to addictions and mental health issues should be a bonus for them to not penalize them, but in fact add value to their own lives and to their own work. So I'm quite supportive of this next stage in Alberta's mental health and addictions programming, and I applaud the government for bringing this forward at a very challenging time in our history. But that very challenge with the opiate crisis, with the new methamphetamine crisis, with the suicide challenges, the mental health issues that are increasing in our society, it begs even more the need to set standards and to have some confidence in where this whole service area is going. And I think this is a very positive step in the right direction. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any members wishing to speak under 29(2)A? Seeing none, are there any other members wishing to speak? The Honourable Member for Vermilion Lloydminster.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise tonight to speak to Bill 30. And I want to say from the outset that, in general, I support the intent of this bill, and I support the notion that mental health and addictions treatment facilities should be brought under some form of regulatory purview, and that this is required. But as my colleague, the member for Calgary Mountain View, just correctly pointed out, there are concerns that have been raised by existing organizations that have a long track record of successfully working within the addictions treatment area. And I want to specifically talk tonight about one such recovery centre that is in my constituency, the Thorpe Recovery Centre. The Thorpe Recovery Centre was founded in Lloydminster in 1975, 43 years ago, by a gentleman by the name of Walter A. Slim Thorpe, as well as Ron Harris Sr. And these two gentlemen, who were absolutely instrumental in getting the Recovery Centre going, recognized the need within the city of Lloydminster for an addictions treatment and detox facility. And they set up a 2-bed facility in an old nurse's residence that was no longer being used for that purpose in Lloydminster. From those humble beginnings in 1988, a 30-bed facility in Lloydminster was constructed, and most recently in 2012, I attended along with former Premier Alison Redford when the 72-bed Thorpe Recovery Centre was officially opened, a 54,000 square foot facility just west of Lloydminster near the community of Blackfoot. I give that background, Madam Speaker, because the Thorpe Recovery Centre has a 43-year track record of providing absolutely essential and outstanding treatment to literally thousands of individuals. And, I'm always gratified when I hear the issue of addictions treatment, and when this issue comes up in the popular media, and when I hear it discussed on various radio programs, the number of people that refer to having been former clients of the Thorpe Recovery Centre in Lloydminster. This is truly an outstanding facility. And it is a facility that is not for profit. It has a volunteer board of directors, an extremely hardworking staff, and is running with some significant financial challenges. And the member for Calgary-Acadia, the former Associate Minister of Health, is well aware of the Thorpe Recovery Centre, and she was very helpful in terms of providing support, and I wish to thank her for that this evening. But the Thorpe Recovery Centre is having some challenges financially, and we have invited the Minister of Health to visit the centre, and we certainly hope that at some point she takes us up on that invitation. I think she will be impressed, like everybody else who has toured the centre, not just with the building, but with the whole ethic, the whole culture of the Thorpe Recovery Centre. When it celebrated its 40th anniversary 3 years ago, Scott Oak, the noted CBC television sports personality who tragically lost a son as a result of addictions a few years ago, was the keynote speaker at that event. And I can tell you that the impact of having a professional detox facility, a professional addictions treatment facility, a facility that does not just treat addiction of alcohol, but also addiction of various drugs, of gambling, of sex, of a wide variety of things that, we as human beings are susceptible to. The Thorpe Recovery Centre is there, and it has been there for many, many years. So when Bill 30 was introduced, I immediately got in touch with the Thorpe Recovery Centre, and I said, what do you think? How would this impact you, and an organization that has been operating with a level of success for many, many years? And there are a number of significant concerns. Once again, they said that they welcome the opportunity to be licensed, to be regulated, and that they hope that that accreditation would open the doors to additional clients from other parts of Canada. Because I know there is some disappointment that despite its location, both the Alberta and the Saskatchewan governments fund a very small number of beds within that facility. The vast majority of the beds are funded privately, quite often by employers of people who are facing addictions. So while licensing will offer opportunities, there's a lot of ambiguity within the bill that cause concern for the Recovery Centre. For example, in Section 7, the licensing fees. What are those fees? What are those fees going to be? They're to be set at some point in the future. But for a not-for-profit organization that is already running on a very tight budget, that is already running in many cases with a lot of volunteer labor, an additional licensing fee, especially if that fee is for a license that has to be renewed annually, is a concern. And, you know, my own feeling would be is that licensing term should be no less than 3 years, and preferably the full 4 years that is being suggested in the legislation. There's concern that requires that the staff be regulated members of the College of Counseling Therapy. Again, and you know, I certainly want to echo the comments of my colleague, the member for Calgary Mountain View. It's not just about your academic accreditation, your academic qualifications. You know, there's a gentleman in Lloydminster who 2 years ago was a guest of the Crown, as I guess we could call it, was in and out of prison, in and out of remand centres on a regular basis. And he was fortunate in that he got the necessary counseling services to address the underlying mental health issue that he had that was causing his addiction, that was driving his criminal activity. And today that gentleman, Tyler Lorenz, has opened a counseling organization in Lloydminster called Residence in Recovery, where he provides counseling services and just support services and education to people trying to escape from a life of addiction that Tyler is incredibly familiar with, and he became familiar with it the hard way. Tyler is an individual who went to school and got a certificate in addictions counseling, but does he qualify under these regulations? Would he be able to be at that facility? It's unclear. So, you know, there's concerns about that. There's concerns about the penalties, you know, that it's not to exceed $10,000, but here again, we are talking about an organization that operates on a very tight budget, and it is extremely efficient, and a good chunk of their budget comes through donations from the general public. A $10,000 penalty for what may be a clerical error would be a significant impact to that organization. So they have a concern about that. Another area that they pointed out to me is under section 12.1, where in terms of notice of inspection, where under 12.1 at current, there's no requirement for any notice or previous indication of an inspector visiting the facility. I can tell you that in a residential addictions treatment facility, that is just plain unfair. This facility is the people's home. And to have an inspector walk in unannounced is simply unfair and can cause significant setback and damage to their treatment. And the suggested minimum period for some form of notice that I've received from the Thorpe is 4 hours. Now, in 4 hours, if you've got major problems in your facility, 4 hours is not enough time to gloss over the problems in your facility, not even close. But it is enough time to let your residents know that you're going to be receiving a visit from an inspector, and that if they are uncomfortable being seen by that person or that sort of thing, that they know that there will be a stranger in their midst. Now, I visited the Thorpe Recovery Centre a number of times, but I will tell you that each and every time that I go, I've been, you know, I'm very well informed that there are folks that I won't see, that will be staying in their rooms, or they'll be staying in areas that are not open to the general public, simply because they don't feel comfortable with people from the general public in their home. And so I will be planning in committee on moving an amendment to at least mandate a minimum 4-hour notice period, which I think is only fair. When I was in veterinary practice, Madam Speaker, we were inspected every 3 years by a practice inspector. And we received a 1 day's notice that that practice inspector was coming. That was certainly very helpful, because it meant that we could make sure that the things that were necessary for the practice inspector to see were readily available to them. and that we had at least one staff member available on that date to tour them through our hospital. If they arrive unannounced on one of the busiest days of the year, or a day where you have got, you know, an incredible amount of other things going on, again, in my view, it is simply unfair to the facility. So this is another concern that I have and that I share with the Thorpe Recovery Centre. Critical incident reporting is another facet that concerns the Thorpe Recovery Centre, because what about the critical incidents that happen after an individual leaves the care of the facility? If that individual should happen to have something serious, like for example a suicide attempt after they leave the care, the truth of the matter is that the facility only is able to track that individual if they stay in touch with the facility through one of their alumni programs. If they, by their own choice, decide not to do that and have a critical incident, there is no way that facilities like this can be aware that they've happened. And so because of that, how can they do the reporting that is mandated under this? There's additional concerns about duplication between AHS and Alberta Health, and I'm sure that this is probably already causing my colleague to smile because this is a favorite topic of his, but there's ambiguity within the legislation as to whether now these recovery facilities are responsible to AHS, with whom some of these facilities have contracts and are required to report, or Alberta Health, and whether they in fact now will have to report to both, which in my view is an unnecessary duplication, requires additional administration, and clearly these facilities want to put their limited resources into counseling and treatment and not into administrative overburden. This is, for example, once again, in the reporting of critical incidents. Under the service contract with AHS, the Thorpe Centre is currently required to report critical incidents to AHS. Now, under this legislation, it's expected to be reported to Alberta Health as well. And so the concern that the Thorpe has communicated to me and that I wanted to talk about today is that while they welcome accreditation, they welcome the idea that somebody is going to monitor and regulate organizations like theirs, and they have absolutely no concern because they're already accredited under the national addictions treatment centers. They are concerned with the additional costs that this will confer upon these facilities. And I want to say one other thing. The Thorpe Recovery Centre operates near Blackfoot, Alberta. Closest large centre is Lloydminster, but it is very much a rural located centre. And it is not easy to recruit qualified staff to that centre. And if these qualified staff members have to go for repeated re-accreditation visits, and if they can't get that accreditation done within the centre, but if they have to travel to Edmonton or Calgary, and if they have to do it every year, and if that is there's a fee involved in being part of a college or an accredited college, that's yet another additional cost that has to either be borne by the counselor or borne by their employer. Some of these costs, it may not sound like they add up to a lot, but I can tell you from having many conversations with people at the Thorpe, they will tell you that every penny is very carefully scrutinized, and all they see in this piece of legislation are additional costs, and they don't necessarily see a great deal of additional benefit because many of these things are already being done in some way, shape, or form. But that said, they're not opposed to the idea of scrutiny. They welcome scrutiny because they're proud of the work they do. And so, Madam Speaker, I have concerns about Bill 30. I will support Bill 30, but I certainly hope that the government is open in these last days of this fall session. We certainly hope that the government is open to looking at some amendments that I think would approve it and would certainly assist with organizations that are already operating. And I would restate and certainly repeat my invitation to the Health Minister to attend and to visit the Thorpe Recovery Centre, because I'm sure that she will be very impressed with what we are doing. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any members wishing to speak under 29(2)A? The Honourable Deputy Minister, Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I was going to try to keep all of my remarks till the end of debate, but I think that there are a few questions I want to address now that were raised by the honourable member and that relate to the questions from the member for Calgary Mountain View as well. So I just want to begin by saying that the reason why AA, NA, faith-based therapies, volunteers, MAP programs, shelters, people with lived experience who aren't calling themselves a counseling therapist are excluded is because they're working in a peer support environment or drawing on that lived experience. They're not calling themselves counselors, and that's why they themselves wouldn't be part of the college, because they're coming at it from a different skill set and a different level of expertise, but also have a different trust relationship with the client. When I think back to a piece of legislation that we just passed earlier this session around protecting patients when accessing healthcare services, I think that the level of engagement with somebody who calls themselves a counseling therapist when it comes to that level of engagement and trust and the risk that could be in place around sexual assault and those types of things speaks to why it's so important that we actually do bring about a licensing process in a college, and that we move this profession that, as the member from Calgary Mountain View has said, many people have hung a shingle and called themselves counseling therapists and put themselves in that position of trust, that there be, with that level of trust, there be a level of responsibility. And that's the role of a college, of any college in any governed profession. So I did want to respond to that in relation to this question that was asked. And then the other piece I just want to say around doing inspections, we use the same baseline around inspections that we have for the Supportive Living Accommodations and Licensing Act, which would apply to long-term care, and it's also the same licensing that we have for foster homes. And certainly I believe that long-term care facilities and foster homes are homes for the residents that live there, and I think that because of that, it's important that we have that level of privacy obviously honored, but also that level of safety and confidence in a facility. So what the language around inspections was pulled specifically from those two pieces of legislation, where we also believe people are living in a home to have it in alignment with that, not that somebody who's living with a substance use condition be treated any differently than somebody else who has another health condition that's requiring long-term care. So that's where we got the inspection language, but I'll just deal with those 2 points at this time and be happy to respond to additional questions in closing, Madam Speaker. Thank you.
Under 29-2A, the honourable member for Calgary Mountain View.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to raise a question with the member from Vermilion Lloydminster. I have some difficulty in inspections being planned and predictable. I think where there are some really unhealthy and unfortunate things going on in institutions, we need to find that out by showing up at unexpected times. So it may well be true that it's inconvenient, that it discomforts some people, but would he not say that in the public interest, the patient interest, we do have to have unannounced inspections to uncover some unsavory things that you would not otherwise identify?
Well, Madam Speaker, with the greatest respect to my colleague, I'm specifically talking about the specific centre that I represent, and I have a high level of confidence that even if you did walk in with zero notice, that they would happily and easily pass any inspection. But this is the level of the concern that they have for their clientele. And they are protective of their clientele. And with all due respect to the health minister, I do think there is a difference between a detox or an addictions treatment centre and the protection for their privacy that the clients of those centres deserve than a residential or a long-term care facility. I absolutely think it's a different level. And so I don't think you can just simply carte blanche, lift a section out of another piece of legislation that may well work fine for that piece of legislation and transplant it into something like this. And I think had the time been taken to talk to people in addictions treatment, and perhaps that time was taken, but certainly nobody talked to the Thorpe, that they would have been happy to offer that piece of advice. And so, with due respect, I don't disagree with what my colleague says with regards to finding out unsavory practices, but 4 hours will not allow you to cover up an unsavory practice. I can tell you that right now. But 4 hours will at least allow you to provide a dignified level of notice to vulnerable persons who are receiving addictions treatment at a time in their lives where they too are vulnerable. And I think it's incredibly important we provide that.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any other members wishing to speak? The Honourable Member for Fort McMurray Conklin.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honour to rise in the House today to speak to Bill 30, the Mental Health Services Protection Act. I'd like to start by acknowledging that this government has chosen to respond to two very real and important issues that are facing our province. Maintaining good mental health services is really crucial if we are going to help our most vulnerable within society. And the attempts to do this through the creation of the College of Counselling Therapy aims to bring accountability to our mental health professionals. It also brings in a mandatory licensing for addiction treatment centres, which will hopefully increase the level of care provided in those, for those that are requiring these services. This legislation is coming at a time when the mental health needs of our province has continued to plummet due to the difficult economic times and the deterioration of our mental health services. This is especially the case in my riding of Fort McMurray Conklin. As is the case after most serious natural disasters or tragedies, the demand and need of mental health services increases substantially. In fact, there was some research that was released at the end of October of 2018, just a few months ago, that suggests that the effects of the fire are still lingering within my community, and they're continuing to see an increased rate of depression and other related mental health issues. The survey, which based its research on about 486 responses that were completed using a standard psychiatric test to assess the mental health effects of the fire. And then through this research, it found that close to 15% of the respondents were suffering with some form of a depressive disorder. It's worth noting that the average rate in Alberta is about 3.3%. So this is still staggeringly high compared to the Alberta average. It also found that those with depressive disorders were far more likely to have alcohol use and substance disorders. The research also found that emotional and social supports were absolutely elemental in ensuring resilience of people. It found that people that received little to no support were 13 times more likely to have a depressive disorder compared to those that didn't. It also found that those with a depressive disorder were substantially more likely to have substance abuse or alcohol abuse issues. Under this government, we've seen the mental health budget nearly double, and yet we haven't seen any true or real result increases with that doubling. And we've seen 74% of children and youth that are offered mental health service treatment, but it's down from 89% in 2014-2015. And unfortunately, of that 74%, only 64% of these children and youth actually end up receiving the mental health treatments that they're seeking out, which is down from 82% in 2014-2015. So we have a long ways to go, and I hope that this bill actually serves in making this better. As I stated earlier, Mr. Speaker, Albertans are suffering, and the need to have access to appropriate services is more important now than ever. I'm glad to see that this government has closed some of the gaps in our services and are aiming to address them. For example, by establishing a College of Counselling Therapy, we will hopefully restore confidence in our counselling professionals and ensure that all Albertans are receiving the absolute highest standard of care available. Through regulations established by the college, we will hopefully be able to ensure that all professionals calling themselves counsellors will have adequate credentials, education, or life experience to be able to provide Albertans with the care they need. Right now, anyone in Alberta can state they're a counsellor, and that can be really misleading to those that are really requiring this help. One of the things that I find might be especially of benefit is the college will also be able to hold its regulated members accountable for their actions. And I truly believe that accountability is so important in our society, and I think that that's a real good step in the right direction. But as we've seen in the past, colleges don't always have the tools they need to deal with issues that they face. In fact, the government's going to have to continue to work with this college to ensure that the outcome and the interests of Albertans are always at the forefront and are the top priority. It'll also help to create a higher standard of care for all Albertans. And this government seems to have done some consultations before tabling this bill, which I'm very grateful to see. The value of consultation prior to tabling a bill is something that I believe is truly invaluable. And I was happy to hear that all 14 counselling associations were consulted and are in favour of this change. However, I must admit that upon doing some consultations of our own, I was disappointed to find out that the government neglected to consult with the Canadian Addiction Counsellor Certification Federation, and which represents about a fifth of all counsellors in Alberta, including Indigenous addictions counsellors, international addictions counsellors, National Defence addiction counsellors, amongst others. And as we've heard from some of my colleagues, their facilities in their communities also were not consulted. But by creating a medical college, we can also have some negative aspects. For instance, we've heard that smaller associations might feel like they have fewer rights when they're grouped in with larger associations in the same college. And it's also harder for regulations to address each individual association's needs. As we've come to learn, a one-size-fits-all system often doesn't work, but I really do hope that the college will do its best to meet the needs of all of the 14 existing associations. The licensing aspect of the residential addiction treatment centres also has some positive aspects. For instance, it establishes who is able to open a residential addiction treatment centre by requiring licensing. Currently, any person or organization can open up a centre regardless of their qualifications, education, or experience. While this can be a major benefit, this can also be a downside, and this bill will help to ensure that all centres are maintaining the highest standard of care for those with addictions. The collection of records and reporting to a director will ensure that the standard of care is maintained over the long term, allowing facilities to perhaps find and identify trends. However, it's often difficult to get these statistics, as many of these organizations operate, as the member from Lloydminster Vermilion indicated earlier, where they don't necessarily have the long-term aspects unless the patients themselves choose to join into the alumni statistics. Furthermore, mandatory inspections will help ensure that the centres are meeting the level of service that Albertans would expect. However, as was previously pointed out, there are some concerns around the inspections and the timing, and making sure that everyone within the facility feels safe and at home. And typically when you're at one of these addiction centres, you're not necessarily there on the best times of your life. So having some of these, making sure that there's adequate protection for these people that are already feeling very vulnerable is, to me, something very important. But one thing that really does worry me is that we can only assume that licensing will come with some kind of a cost to the facility and the organization. These facilities are often nonprofit organizations and are run by grants and donations with very limited government funding. I'm concerned that from some of the facilities I've reached out to, they're very concerned what the cost of the licensing will be and how long the license will last for. If they have to get relicensed every year, that could add some financial burdens as well as some serious administrative burdens. In fact, we heard from stakeholders who have expressed serious concerns about the potential cost increases that may come down the road and how they might be able to even accommodate these. The increased regulations will result in higher credentials being required to provide these services, and while we must ensure that Albertans are receiving the highest standard of care, we also must ensure that these services remain viable over the long term. And there's value in having a variety of different counselling options available. One size, method, or option does not work for all seeking assistance. Furthermore, the vague definition of residential treatment centres is also alarming, as many services may potentially be impacted. For example, it seems to me that a homeless shelter might possibly fit into the definition put forward by the bill. This bill could also potentially increase the cost of taxpayers at a time when Alberta's economy is already suffering. For me, there are way too many unanswered questions in the legislation, and I hope that this government will give us some time to find some of these answers. And I think that that would be extremely helpful if we can get some of these answers. So I'd like to ask the government, how much will the increased regulations cost the centres affected? What is the cost of the licensing? How often will the licensing last for? Like I said, we've had multiple stakeholders express concern over the cost, and to me this is a very real issue. And how does the government intend to maintain the viability of these services as the costs rise? So, Mr. Speaker, did the government intend for this bill to have such wide-ranging implications? Do we perhaps need to tighten up the language on the definition to make sure that it's truly serving the intended goal? And with that, I would like to adjourn debate.
Having heard the motion from the honourable member for Fort McMurray Conklin, all those in favour please say aye. Aye. All those opposed please say no. And that motion is carried.
Under Government Bills and Orders for Second Reading, Bill 31, Miscellaneous Statutes Amendment Act 2018, Honourable